Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the International Online Crime Festival hosted by the one and only crime fiction culture magazine in Turkey, 221B. Today, we have Mr. Leslie Klinger as our guest. Leslie Klinger is one of the genre's most significant experts. He is the annotator and the editor of the amazing 3-volume The New Annotated Sherlock Holmes. He has also provided annotations for H.P. Lovecraft stories, for Dracula, and for Frankenstein. Oh my God, what a career. Hello, Mr. Klinger, and welcome. We are so glad to have you here.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. It's not quite the same as being in Istanbul, but...
Of course. We will hopefully be able to do it next year, I hope.
That would be wonderful.
Well, today we are going to talk about our beloved Sherlock Holmes. Of course, Mr. Klinger, we are going to talk about the new annotated Sherlock Holmes too. I have so many questions about it, but first, I want to delve into the world of Sherlock Holmes, if that's okay for you.
Please.
So, the long-lasting and never-ending adventure of Sherlock Holmes. I would love to start with focusing on Conan Doyle himself a bit. I mean, he was a doctor, he was a writer. Could you talk a bit about how he came to write these stories and how he was able to get them published?
Well, Conan Doyle was determined to be a writer. He had been, when he was a boy, he loved to tell stories, he loved to read, and he wanted to be a writer. He started to write stories that were, today we would call them literary fiction. They were stories about the adventures of various people. One book is about a young couple and so on. They had nothing to do with crime fiction. But he says that he had a revelation that there was a better way to write crime fiction, that it didn't have to be the sort of gimmicky surprise discovery of something and all that. It could be done with an intelligent detective. It's clear that he knew well the writings of Edgar Allan Poe and also Gaboriau, Émile Gaboriau, who'd had a great success as a mystery writer in France. And I think, notwithstanding that at some point he put some words into the mouth of Sherlock Holmes, who deprecates those detectives, Doyle himself admired that work. This was a time in England when crime fiction was growing. There had been some very successful novels written in the 1860s. And so by the time that Conan Doyle got around to it in 1887, there was some precedent for this. He started out by writing a novel. His first, we call it a novel, it's really more of a novella, it's not very long, called A Study in Scarlet. He tried hard to sell it. He sent it to a lot of different magazines himself and failed. Basically, nobody wanted to buy the story until finally Samuel Beeton, the proprietor of the cookbook empire and the magazine empire as well, bought the story and put it into the Christmas Annual. He didn't pay Conan Doyle very much, but Conan Doyle was thrilled to have it in print. And then he returned back to writing stuff that wasn't detective fiction. A couple of years later, he was approached by a man named Joseph Stoddard, who was the editor of Lippincott's magazine in America. And Lippincott's wanted very much to put some new writers, new English writers, into their magazine. And so Stoddard had lunch with Arthur Conan Doyle and another young writer named Oscar Wilde. And he asked both of them if they could provide some material. Well, Wilde produced The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Doyle produced the novel that we call The Sign of Four. And those appeared in Lippincott's magazine in about 1889 or 1890. And then Conan Doyle put it aside again, moved on to other things, went back to writing his normal work. He was enthusiastic about writing historical fiction. But then came the fateful year of 1891 when he tried his hand at some short stories. And his agent, A.P. Watt, submitted them sort of over the transom. They hadn't been asked for, but there was a new magazine just out. There was the publisher, George Nunes, had a great success with a magazine called Titbits. That was a magazine that didn't have fiction in it, but he had built up quite a circulation. And Nunes wanted to launch a new magazine that was going to have a picture on every page. That was sort of the American style, and he thought that would be a big hit in London. And so he created a new magazine called The Strand. Doyle submitted some stories through his agent. The editor, Green F. Smith, loved them and thought they were the freshest, most original things he'd seen in a long time. These, of course, reused the character of Sherlock Holmes that Doyle had written about in A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four. Smith was very enthusiastic about the stories, ordered 6 more, and so that series of 12 stories eventually became collected as The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. They were hugely popular. Smith ordered another 12 stories, which eventually became the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. And that's sort of the early history of Conan Doyle getting into writing these stories. All the while, he viewed these as just sort of something to make some money, something to get his name out there. It took him away from his important work, he felt, which was his historical fiction. And so after the run of 24 stories, he stopped and went back to writing those other books that hardly anybody remembers anymore.
That's true. I mean, Sherlock Holmes was his greatest creation, maybe. But what was the air like in Victorian London? I mean, it was not really a golden age. It was a very difficult time for women, very difficult time for persons of color. But of course, it was the birthplace of the greatest revolutions of the 20th century. What kind of a world was Holmes born into?
A world in which there were marked divides between the rich and the poor, maybe even worse than today. A growing middle class, and interestingly, a time when reading was very much growing. So this is a time before radio, before television, of course. So popular entertainment consisted of the music halls. I'm not talking about for the wealthy. So let's go back one. Let me make this clear. There was a period of time when books and reading was only for the wealthy, basically up until the sort of the middle of the 19th century, as publishing made printed material more inexpensive to produce, or less expensive, and we had the birth of the broadsheets, the penny newspapers, and all that, and schooling. As the board schools grew in England in the middle of the 19th century, children were being taught to read, and the middle class was reading. So by the middle of the 19th century, we have a great expansion of people reading and demanding materials. So we have the birth of the dime novels in America, so-called penny dreadfuls in England. The railroads coming along also changed things because people had time on their hands. They would sit on the train, traveling to and from work. So they were reading newspapers. They were reading cheap paperback books, and eventually magazines. So this is where the great birth of magazines came out. So you had this world where there was a great appetite for reading material. It was a world, as you pointed out, where it was not necessarily a very just world. It was difficult for women to get education. It was certainly very difficult for people of color to get education and find employment. Women employment was largely limited to being a typewritist toward the end of the century, or a governess, or a nanny. Of course, it's one step up from being a servant, but nonetheless, very limited employment opportunities, or the factory, potentially. So it was a bit of a brutal world, but it was also a world that loved the idea of science and loved the idea of reason, rationality. Certainly the Victorian era was a time when people believed that they could solve social and economic problems by industry, by good thoughts, good philosophy, and all that. I mean, maybe today we know better, but there was a strong belief in the power of the mind at that time.
And this was basically the thing that sold the Holmes stories to the Victorians, I guess. This is what his appeal was.
I think that's right. I think that Holmes appealed. I talk about Sherlock Holmes being a superhero who had what I call an attainable superpower, meaning you didn't have to be bitten by a spider. You didn't have to be born on another planet. If you simply worked hard enough, studied enough, you could be sort of like Sherlock Holmes. You could be pretty much like Sherlock Holmes and figure things out and solve problems and solve crimes and so on. And that was a big change for the police. I mean, before this, remember the whole idea in England, and I don't know the history in Turkey, but in England, the history was that the police, the idea of an official police force, was a relatively new idea. Relatively. It was born basically in the early parts of the 19th century. The French had it earlier, but in England, it was really the bobbies, Sir Robert Peel's constabulary, that had any sort of official police at all, as opposed to the village constable, who might be your next door neighbor and sort of the neighborhood watch. So a police force in itself was a relatively new idea, but they largely depended on catching criminals in the act. They might have confidential informants or snitches who would spy on people and report crimes. There wasn't a lot of detection going on. The first detectives, official detectives, were in the early 1860s. And so the whole idea of detection was pretty new to the public. They were mostly used to cops, police, who would grab the criminal on the spot, or maybe somebody would tell them who the criminal was and they would go chase them. They weren't used to detectives having to figure things out. So the private detective, of course, was a new idea created by Poe and a few others. But so the time was ripe for a Sherlock Holmes to appear on the scene. He wasn't the first, but he certainly was far and away the most successful.
Yes, and what was Conan Doyle doing at that time? I mean, how was he feeling? I imagine he was enjoying the popularity for sure, but up until time, he really started to get bored with Holmes.
Yes. As I said before, he wanted to get back to his, quote, better work. He resented the popularity of Sherlock Holmes. He thought it took away from the public's interest in his other writing. He really wanted to write historical novels, and did. And he wrote some wonderful ones. Books like The White Company are brilliant. His Brigadier Gerard novels are fabulous. Others, Rodney Stone, Micah Clarke, these are good books, but they didn't get the attention that Sherlock Holmes did. Now, there was a second reason that I think sort of fed his resentment, and that was he knew how much money he could make from the Sherlock Holmes material. There was a clamor in the period between 1893 and 1901. Conan Doyle didn't write anything about Sherlock Holmes. He stuck to his principles, he worked on other books, and he was very active as a writer. But it wasn't until 1901 that an American publisher, Collier's Magazine, came to him and offered him a lot of money to write 10 new stories for them, that he started the short story writing again. Now, I skipped over. That was actually 1903. 1901, he decided to use Holmes And while he was at it, he made a little more money. He had an idea for a book that was going to be sort of a supernaturally flavored mystery. And he'd gotten fairly far along in writing the book before he realized that he really needed a strong detective figure in the book. And so he thought to himself, well, I guess I'll use Sherlock Holmes. I didn't intend this to be a Sherlock Holmes story, but I'll go back now and make this a Sherlock Holmes story. That turned out to be The Hound of the Baskervilles. It was enormously successful. And the publishers were very appreciative. They actually knew it was going to be successful. And when he said to them, can I use Holmes? They said, sure, and we'll double the pay that we're going to give you for this book if you use Holmes. Because the public had been clamoring for more Sherlock Holmes stories. Well, okay, so he put out The Hound of the Baskervilles. But as we know, that book was a reminiscence of Sherlock Holmes. Spoiler alert here. In 1893, the story called The Final Problem appeared, in which it was revealed that Sherlock Holmes had died, or at least never been seen again, had gone over the Reichenbach Falls in the arms of his arch villain, Professor Moriarty, and vanished, never to be seen again, thought the readers. So in 1901, when a new book came out, the readers were all excited. Holmes is back. No, when they read the book, they realized, no, he wasn't. This took place before the events at the Reichenbach Falls. So great disappointment, but it sort of fed the public appetite for a while. Then in 1903, as I said, Collier's magazine came to him and offered him a lot of money to write another series of short stories. That eventually became the collection called, shamelessly, The Return of Sherlock Holmes. And by the way, the Strand magazine didn't take any chances on this. On the cover, where they advertised the story, which was called The Adventure of the Empty House, it says in big letters at the top of the cover, The Return of Sherlock Holmes. And the public was ecstatic. The Strand magazine circulation zoomed upwards again, and the stories were hugely successful. And at that point, Conan Doyle, I think, sort of bit the bullet and said, okay, I'll keep doing this. He wrote, let's see, we're up to 22 novels, 24 short stories. He went on to write 2 more novels, The Hound of the Baskervilles I mentioned, The Valley of Fear in 1917, excuse me. And then another, I have to do the math, another 32 short stories, beginning with the Empty House, that appeared between 1903 and the last story in 1927. So there was sort of a constant stream. It wasn't one a month like the early days, but it was a regular stream of stories, making him a lot of money. And frankly, I think that's why he ended up doing it. By the last 10 or so stories, he was writing them for the money. He was reusing some of his own plots, and he was using it to support, not that he was some avaricious guy, he was spending a lot of money on the spiritualist movement and was using the money to support it.
Yes, yes, I want to talk about that too, but Conan Doyle resisted for almost 10 years about writing a Holmes story.
Right.
But when he killed Holmes, although he was relieved, we know that because he wrote, I killed Holmes to his mother.
Yes.
He was relieved, but he had a massive reaction from the public, the letters, the armbands, and the Stand magazine lost lots of subscribers.
Yes.
Was there ever an outcry like this regarding a fictional character?
Well, there hadn't been, I mean, there was certainly public mourning before. Little Nell, when she dies, Dickens' character, the public was very upset. And there was the whole same outcry about how dare he do that, and that was terrible. But no, there hadn't, I mean, because Dickens wasn't writing a series of short stories, there wasn't a cry for more. I think that was a unique situation, that the public demanded more stories. By the way, I mean, one of the geniuses of Conan Doyle was this development of the idea of a series of connected short stories. Nobody else had really done that successfully in any field before, where you had stories about the same characters over a long period of time. Typically, short story writers were writing sort of one-offs. There were a few exceptions, but Mrs. Henry Wood comes to mind. She wrote a number of stories sort of set in a neighborhood, but there weren't the same kind of sort of lead characters that we had in Holmes and Watson.
Yes, and Conan Doyle and his deep involvement with the movement known as the spiritualism. Of course, he did not mix this with Holmes. I mean, they are different characters.
Thank goodness, yes.
Thank goodness. But how can we square this fact with a character, with the creator of a character like Sherlock Holmes, who is the ultimate rationalist?
Well, I think the answer is, first of all, this was not some fad for Conan Doyle. He was a seeker for a long time. He was a lapsed Catholic, and early on had started to develop an interest in seances and the whole thing that led to the spiritualist movement. The idea that the spirits of the dead live on and that we can contact them and reach out to them and communicate with them. So he was fascinated by that at a young age. Spiritualism, it's hard for us to put it in perspective. He was not sort of some lone nutcake. There were many, many prominent people involved in the spiritualist movement. And remember, it presented itself as a scientifically based system of beliefs. It never said, take things on faith. It said, we can prove it. We can demonstrate to you that what we're saying is true. Now, was Conan Doyle gullible, a credible person who wanted to believe? Yes. And when we look at some of the demonstrations and the things that he went along with, it's hard to understand. But he did want to believe, and frankly, many, many, many people wanted to believe. The spiritualist movement really reached its height after World War I, when, you know, almost every family had suffered some tragedy, the loss of a brother or sister or a child in the war. And so people desperately wanted to believe that they could have some communication with their loved ones. And so it was not a small crackpot movement. It was quite substantial.
Yes, that's true. Now, I want to talk a bit about the great detective himself, Sherlock Holmes. I know that we don't know much about Holmes's childhood. I mean, there are some facts, of course, and there are some things that we deduce from the stories, like his date of birth. But could you tell us about what we know about his childhood and some theories about his childhood with Michael? How we came to determine his date of birth?
Well, let's start with the date of birth, because that's sort of the funniest, I guess, in a way. So the traditional date is January 6th, 1851. And there's reasons why that, I'm sorry, 1854. I misspoke. So the reasons why, let's start with the 1854. The 1854 is based on nothing more than the story called His Last Bow. In that story, Conan Doyle has impersonated a man named Altamont, who appears to be a man of about 60. So that story takes place in 1914 on the eve of World War I. So 1914 minus 60 is 1854. Pretty thin reasoning for several reasons. Number one, it says he appears to be a man of about 60. Number two, this is a disguise. So how do we really pin it down to 1854? Pretty shaky. So then we get to the birth date itself, even shakier. The reasons that are given are, number one, Holmes, or Watson actually, in the stories, quotes Holmes twice as referring to the play Twelfth Night by Shakespeare. January 6th is Twelfth Night, according to most reckonings. And so somehow that shows that Sherlock Holmes favored that date. Second, on the day after January 6th, one of the stories takes place on the day after January 6th, and Sherlock Holmes seems to have some symptoms that possibly could be explained as a hangover. And so this suggests to scholars that the night before he was celebrating his birthday. Is that part of Holmes's character? I don't think so. That's pretty fit. The real reason is, of course, that his birthday was announced by Christopher Morley. Christopher Morley, the founder of the Baker Street Irregulars, said, we're going to celebrate his birthday as January 6th. The fact that it happened to be the birthday of Morley's brother, totally coincidental. So thin evidence. And this has been a constant discussion among the circles of the Baker Street Irregulars, because every year there is a celebration of his birthday in New York. Well, New York in January is not the most optimal time to visit. So some have suggested, couldn't we please celebrate it in April, for example? There's just as much evidence for April as there is for January. Anyway, but as to his upbringing, his parentage and his upbringing, we know virtually nothing. He describes his parents as living the life of country squires. He doesn't say they were country squires. He says living the life of country squires, his family. He doesn't say his parents. And that's all we know. We don't know where. We don't know whether he had siblings, with one exception, and that is his older brother, Mycroft, who is 7 years older than him. Did he have other siblings? Rampant speculation that he did. Some have suggested, for example, a brother named Sharonford. Most recently, there has been a movie and a number of books about his younger sister, Enola. The makers of the BBC Sherlock imagined a sister whose name I've erased from my mind because I hated it, but Eurus or something like that.
Yes.
So there's always been interesting speculation about his family, but we have nothing concrete to go on. Probably the most interesting speculation is the now very famous novel called The 7% Solution, written by Nicholas Meyer, came out in 1974, in which he speculated that Holmes's mother had been having an affair with his mathematics teacher, one James Moriarty, and that this led to future events. But it's all speculation. It's all great fun, but it's just speculation.
Yes, some scholars also speculate that Sherlock Holmes and Mycroft grew up in a loveless home. That's why they are this, how to put it, antisocial beings, smart but antisocial. How would you approach to this?
Oh, I think that's charming speculation. I mean, there's all kinds of things. I gave a talk I gave a talk at the Baker Street Irregulars dinner last year, a brief talk, in which I argued that Mycroft Holmes was in fact a woman, and that this is part of why she was so antisocial, etc. It was because she was passing for male and therefore avoided close contact with many people. And you know, it made sense to me because it was very difficult for a woman that smart to get the kind of job that she wanted, to get the kind of career that she wanted in England. So she passed for a male, and Sherlock supported her in that.
That's a great theory too. I mean,
it'll appear in the Baker Street Journal later this year, in the winter issue, I think. So.
Oh, great! Amazing. Looking forward to it. So, as you mentioned earlier, we also have James Moriarty, Sherlock Holmes's arch enemy. His perfect opposite. I mean, not opposite per se, but they are both smart, they are both driven, but Holmes fights crime, whereas Moriarty is the criminal himself. How would you evaluate their relationship?
Well, I think they, in a sense, needed each other. I mean, it provided each of them with the motivation to sharpen their skills and do their best. Moriarty, I love the description that Holmes uses about how some trees grow to a point normally, and then a branch shoots off in a kind of twisted or gnarled way. And that's what he thinks happened to Moriarty, that he started out as a respectable person, and then at some point found it easier or more rewarding to do evil things. Moriarty is not, I mean, unlike some crime writers who have long-running villains, Moriarty doesn't appear much in the stories. He's gotten a reputation sort of far in excess of his, shall we call it, screen time. He only really appears in 2 stories, and is talked about in a third, The Empty House. He appears in The Final Problem. He's sort of on camera in The Final Problem. He's on camera in The Valley of Fear, and he is talked about in The Empty House. And that's it. And people have suggested that he had a hand in other adventures, that he was behind the scenes. For example, with the Red-Headed League, that's an invention of the Granada TV series scripting. And I find some of those intriguing, but you know, people have wanted to make Moriarty into a larger and larger figure than, in fact, Conan Doyle did. I think Conan Doyle used him as mainly a way to sort of wrap up the series. When he wrote The Final Problem, you know, if you're going to have the last story, which is what Conan Doyle figured it was going to be, you know, send your hero out in a blaze. And who could take down Sherlock Holmes? It couldn't be just some random petty criminal. It had to be a genius who ended up being the ultimate end of Holmes's career. And of course, it also puts a noble spin on it. I mean, Holmes says, you know, I may be going to my death here, but it's for a good cause.
Yes, and I fought the criminal, I fought the evil.
Yes.
So, I want to pass on to John Watson, the chronicler of the adventures of Holmes. Holmes is lost without his Boswell. Watson is smart, he is brave, he is dependable, and he's also our vessel into the minds and methods of Sherlock.
Absolutely, and we would be lost without his Boswell. It's, as we can see from the 2 examples of stories written by Holmes himself, they're not very enjoyable. They're just not the same as having a story told about you by somebody else. And I think that although Sherlock Holmes himself is something for which, of course, we must give tremendous credit to Conan Doyle for creating such a wonderful character, the real innovation that he made in crime fiction was the introduction of the sidekick. I mean, there is a narrator in Poe's stories, but I defy anyone to even remember his name, much less tell me anything about him. And Gaboriau, the same thing. Just nobody worth mentioning. Watson is a living, breathing character. And, you know, if we think about it rationally, I would not I don't think anybody would enjoy being in the company of Sherlock Holmes very much. He was prickly and arrogant and often distracted and would not pay much attention to you, frankly. Watson, on the other hand, wow, I mean, there's a guy that you want to sit down with and share a few beers and tell stories and hear him talk. I think the most brilliant example of that is the radio series, where every week the old Basil Rathbone Nigel Bruce radio series, where every week the host would sit down with Dr. Watson and Dr. Watson would tell him a story. That's the great innovation that Conan Doyle made. Was he discovered how useful it was to have a sidekick, to give you second points of view, to give you suspense, to have somebody who could ask the hard questions, and not, as too many people think, somebody who just goes, "Attaboy, Sherlock, way to go, Sherlock, brilliant, Sherlock." That's not what Watson does. Watson is a real three-dimensional character with his own opinions, his own attitudes, who takes active roles in these stories, but lends a great deal of pleasure to the reader.
Yes, Watson is us. He's in our place, and we look at Holmes and his adventures from his eyes.
Yes.
So Sherlock Holmes and his approach to women. He has a very debatable approach to women. We have Irene Adler, the woman for whom Holmes has some feelings, but it's not love. But also in some stories, like in The Adventure of the Speckled Wand, when this young woman, Helen Stoner, comes to Holmes for help, she's stressed, she is agitated, she is a little bit abused, and Holmes grabs her by the wrist to see the thumb marks, and that's kind of a violence. So his approach to women is very debatable. How would you interpret this approach, both with Irene Adler?
First of all, I am not one of those who thinks that there is a lot more to be said about the Irene Adler Sherlock Holmes relationship. I don't think it went on in secret after that. I don't think they got back together. I love the idea that they had a tryst in Montenegro, from which tryst was born the detective Nero Wolfe. But that to me is a stretch. Again, it's just people having fun, going way beyond the evidence in the canon. I believe Holmes when he saw this as more of sort of intellectual relationship. Clearly, he had some feelings for her. Perhaps he thought to himself, if I had gone down a different road in my life, this woman would have been somebody that I would have loved and had a relationship with. But why is Holmes that way? That's a fascinating question. And as I said earlier, Nicholas Meyer, in his 7% Solution, offered the suggestion that it was a reaction to seeing his mother in being engaging in infidelity that put him off women. There are certainly others who have suggested many other motives, that there was a relationship when he was much younger that went bad. I'm not sure I buy those rationales. I think that there are some people who just find the idea of a romantic relationship not particularly interesting. Holmes was busy with many other things. I mean, I'm always asked when I give talks about this, was Sherlock Holmes gay? Don't I think he was gay? There's all this suggestion of this and that. And my answer generally is no. I just think he was just too busy. He didn't have relationships with women. He didn't have relationships with men. He was consumed by the life of the mind and didn't find the idea of a deep interpersonal relationship particularly appealing. Did he behave badly to women? I think he behaved better than the standards of the times. I'm not going, that's not a very high bar, but I think he treated women with more respect, more courtesy than many men did. And he certainly could respect that a woman had intellect, skills that were noteworthy in certain cases. And that's not saying a whole lot, but
yes, of course, I agree with you too about Irene Adler and both his approach to women. I mean, he gets to be interpreted like the enemy of women, but as you say, he's much better than most of the men, especially of the era. Even to Helen, I mean, he consoles her. He lets her drink water. I mean, he comforts her. So yes, that's the.
And he believes her. He believes
her.
He takes her story for not some hysterical reaction, and he takes her very seriously.
Yes, yes, exactly. And he finds the perfect solution, of course, for the revelation of the crime, and this can bring us to his way of thinking. He's a systematic thinker. He's a scientist. He's a logician. He has this brain ethic theory where he says that filling your brain with unnecessary info would leave out no place for the real useful things. But in his later stories, like The Value of Fear, for example, he also says that every kind of information is useful for a detective. I mean, this, of course, this depends to Arthur Conan Doyle and his process of writing. But how would you interpret his method of thinking, his scientific mind?
I think that the Valley of Fear reflects a certain increase in Holmes's maturity as we get older. Yes. Is it inevitable that I've forgotten things that I knew 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? Yes. But it's also the case that I'll come across something that I did know 30 years ago that I never thought would have any particular usefulness that today has turned out to be something useful. Hence all the books. This is why I can't bear to ever throw a book away, because I might find some future use for it. Holmes is, of course, not strictly rational. He is also very much an experimentalist in the sense of wanting to gather physical evidence, testing things out, and seeing how they work. So this is not somebody like the old man in the corner, the detective created by the Baroness Orczy, who sits literally in a corner and listens to the story and reasons out a solution. Nor is he Mycroft, who cannot be bothered to sort of leave his chair and get down on the ground and look for clues. So Holmes is a man who understands and is one of the early proponents of the Locardian idea of trace evidence and all that. And so he understands that in order to be a detective, it can't just all be up here. You've got to actually get down in the dirt and look for evidence, clues, if you will.
And his methods were, I mean, he was a pioneer in forensic science too. Many of the methods he used were new or not used before by the police force.
That's correct. It was a time when everybody was learning quickly a lot of things. Fingerprinting, for example, is a pretty new science. And the idea that fingerprints were unique had been around for a while. And Holmes is not the first to use fingerprints in solving a case. But Holmes was, of course, greatly hampered in the respect of fingerprints in that there were no databases. You couldn't use a fingerprint to identify, to literally identify somebody. You could only use fingerprints to confirm that so-and-so had been at the scene of the crime and left fingerprints. But nonetheless, he recognized that evidence. And there's many other things. Obviously, the chemical ideas, the ideas about the study of blood, the idea, even as I said, the Locardian principle of finding disturbances at the scene of the crime, fibers, matches, ashes, all those things. Those are new ideas for the police because there's never been a need before. There's never been detectives until, as I said earlier, the 1860s.
Yes. So Holmes not only affected the literature, the fictional world, but he also affected, of course, these developments would eventually came to be, but the stories are pioneer in this respect.
Yes, I think they taught a lot of police that there was something to be gained by using methods that may have seemed sort of outside the box, that they didn't need to simply rely on thief catchers, thief takers, spies, that they could actually follow up evidence and use it to solve crimes.
Exactly. I mean, his image with his magnifying glass has been, it's in our minds and will be in our minds forever.
Yes.
So, but actually, Arthur Conan Doyle was not really very kind in the detailed depiction of Holmes. I mean, his pipe, the deerstalker hat. I mean, he had robes. We know he had coats, but when we consider his image, many of them came from the illustrators. I mean, yes. Conan Doyle's father himself, but more importantly, Sidney Paget, and they're still in America. Could you talk a little bit about the illustrators of Holmes?
Well, as you mentioned, the first illustrator was his father, Charles Altamont Doyle, named Altamont, by the way, noteworthy. And he illustrated, I thought, incredibly badly, Study in Scarlet. The pictures are not very interesting. It's not even clear that the picture on the cover of Beaton's Annual is Holmes himself. We don't know. But the first great illustrator was Sidney Paget. There are some debates, I think they're now over, about whether he was the intended illustrator or whether it was his brother Walter. But it seems now pretty clear that it was Sidney who was meant to be the illustrator. And up until basically he died, I think before The Hound was published. So really, he only illustrated the adventures and the memoirs and A Study in Scarlet. And no, I'm sorry, didn't even illustrate that. So the adventures and the memoirs. But those are the images of Holmes that have endured. They're fascinating images of both men, and striking, beautiful. There's a bunch of them. But in terms of influence, Frederick Dorr Steele became the illustrator, but it wasn't. But his image in America, and he did hundreds of images of Holmes in America, and they appeared on places like cigar labels and the like. But there's a big difference. In the case of Sidney Paget, Sidney actually used, I think, his brother Walter as a model. But we don't really know much about Walter. In the case of Frederick Dorr Steele, it's perfectly clear that he used William Gillette as his model. William Gillette, the stage actor who in 1899 made the role of Sherlock Holmes his forever, appearing in the role for the next 28 years, and indelibly becoming the way that everybody assumed Sherlock Holmes looked. With the beak nose and the sharp chin and very strong features, tall, lean, etc. So, yeah, Conan Doyle's pretty vague. What does it mean that he looked like a cigar store Indian, sort of a red Indian? I'm not sure what that means.
Yes.
Maybe it means a big nose. I don't know.
Yes. Yes, William Gillette, the American actor, portrayed Holmes for almost 30 years. But if I'm not mistaken, he did not have a Watson with him.
That's correct. There's no Watson in any of those stories. There's also a love interest in some of those stories, which in a slightly later version of the play. There are different versions in which Holmes marries the heroine and some in which he doesn't, all by Gillette. But yeah, no Watson. You don't have a James Moriarty either. You have
Yes.
Robert Moriarty.
Yes.
And so on. So Gillette did take some liberties in doing it. Famously, he wrote to Conan Doyle and said to Conan Doyle, may I marry Holmes? And Conan Doyle said, basically, do whatever you want. Just send me the check.
Of course, that's very Conan Doyle indeed.
Yes.
So if we talk about William Gillette, we can pass on to the adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, both in cinema and television. Recently, of course, we had a wave, we still have a wave, BBC Sherlock, Elementary, Robert Downey Jr. films, Enola Holmes, Mr. Holmes. I would love to get your opinion about all of them, but I imagine this is not the first wave of adaptations, at least after the stories.
Of course. It seems to come in waves. You said it exactly right. I mean, Sherlock Holmes is the most filmed character of all time. More than Dracula, more than Tarzan. Those are, I think, respectively number 2 and 3 on the list. But far and away, Sherlock Holmes. And so the Holmes films go back to early silent films, very early. 1901 seems to be the very first silent Sherlock Holmes film. There's a 1905 film called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Some of those films, many of those films are lost, sadly. Recently, a film of the Gillette play was just discovered. And when I say recently, in the last 5 years now, I think, and has been released on DVD. But so you can't quite call that a wave. There were over, I think, over 100 Sherlock Holmes films made in the silent era. And so you had a series of films starring Ely Norwood. You had Viggo Larsen as Sherlock Holmes and so on, people that only Sherlockians know now, but some of the great actors of the day. You had a smattering of films in the 1930s. There was a brief wavelet, we'll call it, with Arthur Wantner, starring in 4 films about Sherlock Holmes. Then another great wave in the 1940s, late 1939, and then the 1940s, with Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce in a series of 12 films. Then all was quiet for a while. In the 1970s, we had the beginning of another wave. The 7% Solution was not only a hugely successful book, but it was also a very successful film. And there were a few other films of that era. And then again, sort of subsidence. The Granada series began in the Granada television series in the late 80s, early 90s. That was a wave, died down, nothing much happening until basically the Robert Downey series, which came out almost simultaneously with the BBC's Sherlock. And so once again, a great wave. And what happens every time there's a wave like that is there's a whole new generation of people who discover Sherlock Holmes. I love to tell the story about giving a lecture at the Newberry Library in Chicago, one of the finest libraries in the world, with a magnificent collection of Holmes material. And a woman came up to me after my talk and said, "I'm so glad I came to your talk today, Mr. Klinger. I love Sherlock Holmes. I didn't know there were books." And, you know, what can I say? I mean, this is a woman who had come to Holmes, as many do, through the films, through television, and so on. And that's all she knew. And fortunately, friends of mine who were booksellers told me that when the Downey films and the BBC Sherlock was on, book sales were booming. People were coming in and buying copies of the canon, copies of the original stories to read them. And that's wonderful. And many of those people have become Sherlockians, Holmesians, and stayed. Not all, but, you know, many have. So the waves bring in new adherents to our little cult, and it's a good thing.
Yes, and who would be your favorite Sherlock Holmes?
I knew you were going to ask. I have publicly said many times that it was Jeremy Brett. That the Brett series, not just the acting. I mean, Brett himself worked very hard to have a character that was true to the original stories, but he was helped immensely by screenwriters who wrote scripts that were very close to the original stories. So, I mean, there are certainly other actors who have been fine portrayers. Basil Rathbone, for example, too old for the part, but nonetheless, really is a convincing Sherlock Holmes. I see both of those men as carrying across this idea of mine that Holmes is not a particularly romantic figure, that he is busy with his own mental life and has difficulty relating to other people. I'm very fond of Robert Downey's portrayal. Now, the fact that I was a technical advisor for those films and that Robert has become a friend has something to do with it.
Yes.
But I think they had a wonderful spirit, and I know that the producers and Robert himself loved the original stories and wanted to keep as much of the flavor, the feel of the original stories as possible. So I will say that it's Jeremy Brett is my favorite, but it's not a runaway race by any means. There are so many that did come up there. And by the way, Jude Law, who we see depicted here with Robert, I do contend is the finest Watson that we've ever had portrayed on the screen.
Yes, Jeremy Brett is my favorite too. But what I love the most about those series is, yes, they are true to the original stories. We have some lines from the stories. Jeremy Brett is great, but so is Watson. I mean, the portrayal of Watson. I mean, he really deserves that portrayal because that's who Watson is, really.
It's the first series to get it right.
Yes. Yes.
It's been, I mean, I think, as I say, I think the Downey films did it again, but certainly the Granada series gets credit for the first time that Watson was shown the way he should be, as somebody intelligent, stalwart, trustworthy, and somebody worthy of being Holmes's roommate.
Yes, of course. I also love the idea of Watson being a woman. Lucy Liu, amazing work, amazing portrayal.
I'm very fond of that series too, and again, they were the writers and I became friends. Is a little strong, but we communicated frequently during the series. They had my books in the writing room. They told me, and the showrunner Rob Doherty loved Sherlock Holmes, and we would often discuss things. And I love the Easter eggs in the series, just sort of little touches. A housekeeper who turns out to be named Hudson, and so on. They've never made they never sort of rubbed your nose in the canonical touches in the story, but there were plenty of them.
Yes, true. The same goes for BBC Sherlock, I guess. Martin Freeman does a great job too. Benedict Cumberbatch is a fresh Sherlock, of course. But the stories have been adapted mostly great to our modern age. We also had movies like Mr. Holmes, it was really sad for me to see a Sherlock Holmes who was, of course, he was not miserable, but he was human. I mean, also Enola Holmes. How did you find these movies?
Oh, I love them all. I love them all. I must say that I am not very discriminating. There is one exception. I will not watch. Well, maybe someday I will. The Will Ferrell Holmes and Watson. But my general attitude is that any film about Sherlock Holmes is a good film because it's about Sherlock Holmes. I mean, I enjoyed what was the name of it? The Sherlock Holmes, the gnomes, the Sherlock Gnomes.
Sherlock Holmes, yes.
You know, so I'm not a person above low tastes. I actually like the Peter Cook, Dudley Moore, Hound of the Baskervilles. So I'm not one who has extremely high standards, but from everything I understand about the Will Ferrell one, it just went a little too far. Yeah. But generally, I love all the films. I love the fresh viewpoints. I like the idea of exploring different relationships. It's what I loved about Elementary. There's no reason why Watson had to be a male character, and I thought it went very well. Some of the modern ones in which Holmes himself is a woman. Holmes himself is a woman. It didn't come out quite right, but in English anyway. They're all fun and they're all interesting to me as they explore these possibilities. The Enola Holmes film I thought was charming, and I hope there will be more. I was also the technical advisor on that, and I hope there'll be more, and that they will continue to be serious about trying to get it right, which is all we ask. Be respectful of the original material. You can make fun of it, but know the original material. Yes,
of course. The same goes for pastiches. We love to read new Holmes stories. I mean, you also edited A Study in Sherlock. But can you tell us about that project, how it came to be realized?
Sure. And there's now, thank you for that, because now I can mention to everybody the newest book in that series called In League with Sherlock Holmes, which came out in December. So Laurie King, the author of the Mary Russell series of novels, who is herself a very respectful author of, I guess we'd have to call them pastiche. Holmes is not the primary character in those stories. They're primarily about a young woman named Mary Russell. But Sherlock Holmes eventually becomes her husband. Well, in any event, Laurie and I were on a panel together at a crime writers convention back probably 2009 or 2010, something like that. And the organizers asked us who we wanted to have on the panel with us. And I said, Michael Connelly, Lee Child, and Jan Burke. They were all attending the convention. And the organizers said, well, those are our guests of honor. You know, you can't just put all the guests of honor on one panel. I said, well, this is a different idea. I know that they are secretly Sherlock Holmes fans. So putting them on a panel, not to talk about their own books, but to talk about Sherlock Holmes, that will be fascinating. And it was great. And they would sit there and Lee would say, well, I don't know much about the Sherlock Holmes stories, but, and then come out with some very trenchant observation. And Michael Connelly would do the same, and Jan Burke would do the same. So it was a revelation. And after the panel, I said to Laurie, I wonder if they'd be interested in writing stories inspired by the Sherlock Holmes canon. And we asked them, and they said, sure. And so did a bunch of other people, including Neil Gaiman and Laura Lippman, and I can't even remember everybody that was in our first collection. So that became a collection called A Study in Sherlock. These are not, we have never asked the writers to write Sherlock Holmes stories. We have said, we want you to write stories inspired by the Sherlock Holmes stories. They can be about Holmes or Watson. They can be about one of the other characters. They can be somebody like Sherlock Holmes or Watson. They can be somebody who themselves has been influenced by the Sherlock Holmes stories, who admires Sherlock Holmes or hates Sherlock Holmes. They can be Victorian, they can be contemporary, or anything in between. We've done 5 volumes now. The second one is called In the Company of Sherlock Holmes. The third one is called Echoes of Sherlock Holmes. And I'm leaving one out. The new, which I'm embarrassed. I can't even remember the name of the fourth one. But we've had 75 writers at this point writing stories for us, and they're wonderful. They're just amazing to read. They're all so different from each other. One of them is just, I mean, there's stories about Conan Doyle, there's stories about other contemporaries, etc. They're charming stories. Echoes, In the Company, In League with Wow. I can't think of that. I have to look at my bookshelf to see the name of it. It'll come to me.
Yes. So, as we near the end of our talk, Mr. Klinger, how did you get interested in Sherlock Holmes in the first place?
Well, so I'll try and give you the sort of middle-length version of that story. So when I was in law school, many years ago, I was a diligent student who studied hard, worked hard, and had a program of recreational reading. I said to myself, I have to be able to read something other than law books from time to time. And so I started reading science fiction stories and the like late at night. And I was very fortunate. A book had just come out in 1968 called The Annotated Sherlock Holmes, and by William S. Baring-Gould. And my wife at the time, my first wife, bought that for me as a gift. And I was hooked. I was immediately hooked. I loved the footnotes. I loved the whole idea that there was a cult of Sherlock Holmes, and started subscribing to the Baker Street Journal. I didn't do any scholarship, but I started in a very sort of uninformed way collecting things about Sherlock Holmes. I had a small collection. I had about 100 books. And then in the mid-70s, I saw an ad for a larger collection of Sherlock Holmes books, bought that, suddenly had 400 books on Sherlock Holmes, and realized that there was a lot of good things to be collected and that they were much higher quality than the junk I had collected to date. So I became a serious collector. And for the first 20 years or so, that's all I did. Collected Sherlock Holmes and gave the occasional talk about collecting Sherlock Holmes. And once in a while, I gave a talk about Holmes's life. But I had always fantasized that when I was old, maybe I would get to be the person who would redo that magnificent Baring-Gould annotated Sherlock Holmes. And in the mid-90s, my wife, Sharon, second wife, Sharon, said to me, you know, sort of, what are you waiting for? Why don't you get started on doing that now? You don't have to be old and retired to do this. And I started working on re-annotating some of the stories. That led to the series of books that was eventually called the Sherlock Holmes Reference Library, which is a 10-volume set of the original stories with the long footnotes about everything, very few pictures. And then in 2002, out of the blue, really literally out of the blue, I got a call from the senior editor at W.W. Norton, who said to me, you know, we're going to reissue that Baring-Gould annotated Sherlock Holmes. We need somebody to edit it. We hear that you're the guy who should do that. And I was like, me? You know, I'm just a lawyer from Los Angeles who's written these little books. They said, no. And I said, you know, you're going to pay me and all that? Yes. So I undertook the project, and that was really the big step that led to a whole bunch more books after that. By the way, the book that I forgot was called For the Sake of the Game. That was
For the Sake of the Game, okay. Okay. So, Mr. Klinger, you mentioned that you are also a collector of Sherlock Holmes. I mean,
yes.
Here in Turkey, we love Sherlock Holmes, we read Sherlock Holmes, but there are not many academic researches about the great detective and his works. Of course, we try to approach it that way as much as we can in our magazine, 221B. But what would you say, could you name an interesting research about Holmes that you encountered?
Oh, well, there's so many fascinating subjects. One of them we alluded to briefly earlier, for example, in The Speckled Band. What was that snake? There's no such thing as a swamp adder. So what kind of snake was it? And there's been interesting research done, some of it regional. For example, there's been several articles in the Australian Sherlockian journals suggesting some Australian critters that could have been what that snake was. So there's always that sort of regional thing to it. But no, there are dozens of fascinating questions to be explored, the evidence sifted, and papers written. For example, we've talked about Holmes's youth, and we know very little about his college education. We have some guesses about where he attended school, but exactly what he studied and what interested him, we don't know. So there are dozens and dozens of subjects left to be explored. Nothing is definitive. There are no definitive answers to anything. I wrote a paper a number of years ago called "What Do We Really Know About Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson?" And when I conceived of that paper, I thought, this is it. I'm prepared to write the definitive paper that will establish the pillars of wisdom of our knowledge about Sherlock Holmes. And the more I got into it, the more I realized how little we knew. And I pointed out in the article that, for example, we can't even really be sure that these two men were named Sherlock Holmes and John Watson. Why would they be? They were, Sherlock Holmes was in active practice trying to attract clients. Would you hire a detective if you knew that the detective's friend was going to publish all the details of your case with the names changed slightly, soon after that? I don't think so. So I'm not sure that the detective's name really was Sherlock Holmes and that there really was a John Watson. So there are many, many, many topics to be explored because we just don't know very much at all.
Yes. So, Mr. Klinger, editing an annotated work, putting together an anthology must be a challenging work. I mean, I want to know what was the toughest part, and of course we are glad for that work, but why and why now?
Well, as I said, I had always had the compulsion that I would do it, and people say, how long did it take? And the answer is in part 37 years. So because, I mean, in a sense, I started writing it the minute that I read Baring-Gould, and started having questions about some of the things that he said, and the minute that I started subscribing to the Baker Street Journal and reading other people's theories and all that. The project itself was really, I mean, it was spread out over a long period of time. I started doing the Sherlock Holmes reference library because I practice law full time. So I was doing the reference library pretty much one volume a year. That had to be somewhat accelerated. I was about halfway through that series, 2/3 of the way through when we did the Norton series, but every single footnote had to be rewritten because they wanted a different style. They wanted more material. They wanted material that wasn't as much direct quotation. So it was a lot of work. But it was all such a joy. I mean, one of the great pleasures was to use my collection. It was very rare that I needed a resource that I didn't have, the magazine or the book to look at. And of course, I had three great advantages over William S. Baring-Gould. Number one, I had the benefit of the brilliant bibliography by Ronald B. Dewall of 25,000 things Sherlockian or so. And now, of course, it's grown even more. So I had the bibliography that he didn't have. Number two, I had the internet and computers. So that Baring-Gould apparently did this with note cards. I was able to use the computers to do word processing, and of course the internet to look up many, many things. And number three, I had the great advantage of starting with Baring-Gould. I got to look at what he'd done and say, oh, that's an interesting thing. I can expand on it. I can do more research and so on. So I had it much easier than Baring-Gould did. There's no question.
Mr. Klinger, you also begin with the idea that Sherlockian circles call the game. The idea that Holmes was a real person, the stories were really written by John Watson, Conan Doyle was Watson's literary agent, a very different approach to the stories. What would we gain from this approach?
I think we gain a deeper appreciation of the stories, because once you start to play the game, you really have to see how the stories work, what makes them work, what is the connective tissue among the stories. We're doing, in a sense, I mean, some writers, television writers especially, create what they call the Bible, the backstory to everything. They lay out all the connective tissues, all the threads that tell us much more about the characters and the settings than can possibly appear in the books. And there's a great pleasure to be had in looking at those things. I have a very expansive appetite for more knowledge, more things that I want to know about. And so I love the byways. I love that focusing on, for example, in the story, The Resident Patient, that Dr. Watson gives artificial respiration to one of the characters. What was that? What did that mean at that time? What was artificial respiration? There were doing some research about it, turns out there were different kinds, different schools of thought about how to approach that and what worked. It's not in the story. Some of it was just assumed that the readers would know, but much of it was something that just was sitting behind the story, and playing the game gives us that opportunity. If we say this is fiction, then none of that matters. And so we can't dive into it. I mean, who is going to look at the school records of Oxford to find a student named S. Holmes unless you're playing the game? What would be the point? But what pleasure to do that.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Mr. Klinger. One last question I will have for you. What is your favorite Holmes story?
Well, that's easy. It's The Blue Carbuncle. And I love that story for many reasons. It's a Christmas story that has a certain emotional tone that none of the other stories really do. It's the season of forgiveness. It's got some wonderful deductions, even though I think they're mostly specious about the hat and things like that. It's got a charming idea, this idea of chasing down this goose. But most of all, it's such a lovely portrayal of the friendship of Holmes and Watson. All of that sort of in one package makes it my favorite story.
Mr. Klinger, thank you so much. What a delightful conversation. We are so glad to have you with us here. I hope we can do this in person next year.
I would love that. I would love that. I had a wonderful, I met so many wonderful people on my trip to Black Week in Istanbul a few years ago, and was thrilled to find that there were not only Sherlockians, but crime fiction thriving in Turkey. So,
of course,
believe me, I'm deeply honored to be an honorary member of the Crime Writers of Turkey. So
yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Klinger.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.